troubles, the suffering on all humanity. Christ the judge is going to pronounce sentence guilty. A terrible thing the way humans have been misled. Well, you listen to me, I bring you good news. That is going to happen.
Doomsday Preacher Herbert Armstrong and his organization, the Worldwide Church of God, preyed on the vulnerable and ignorant. A former salesman turned radio preacher, Herbert Armstrong swindled tens of thousands into believing his dangerous form of Christianity. It seems inconceivable that a world chess champion like Bobby Fischer would be susceptible to such brainwashing. However, Fischer was another victim of Herbert Armstrong's greed. So how was he manipulated? Throughout his turbulent childhood, Bobby Fischer yearned for guidance and structure. A tumultuous relationship with his mother and a non-existent father left Fischer feeling empty. Fischer attempted to drown out his emotional wounds with countless hours of chess. As a teenager, this seemed to suffice. However, as Fischer grew older, he wanted something more. Beginning in 1962 at the age of 23, Fischer began listening to radio sermons to alleviate his personal problems, eventually stumbling upon The World Tomorrow. On the surface, The World Tomorrow seemed like a harmless evangelical radio broadcast. Herbert Armstrong and his son Ted advocated such virtues as hard work and dedication to one's goals, all the while pushing the narrative that British and American peoples were direct descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Fischer admired Herbert Armstrong's knowledge of biblical texts. Radio contemporaries at the time were unable to dissect the scripture as deep as Herbert Armstrong. Soon Fischer was listening to the program every Saturday fanatically. Behind the facade of living a moral existence, The World Tomorrow promoted Herbert Armstrong's prophecy that the world would end in 1975. Herbert Armstrong claimed technological advancements, such as the hydrogen bomb, would spell the end of humanity. This message was shoved down listeners' throats endlessly. Another tenet of the religion was that human nature is inherently wicked. Therefore, parishioners were ordered to treat their own thoughts as if they were the work of the devil. The only ones who could be trusted were Herbert Armstrong and his church cronies. Herbert Armstrong also advocated the practice of tithing. Tithing consists of giving 10% of one's income to the church. Herbert Armstrong belittled believers who didn't practice tithing. He considered them stealing from the Almighty. Initially, Fischer was hesitant to give any money to the organization. However, once Fischer's curiosity was sparked by the radio broadcast, he began reading a Worldwide Church of God magazine called The Plain Truth. The magazine was free of charge and flooded with potential converts. After digesting a plethora of radio and magazine material, Fischer began feeling guilty. At first, Fischer sent $5 to the Worldwide Church of God, then $20. Not before long, Fischer was tithing. When he won the World Chess Championship in 1972 against Boris Spassky, Fischer donated $61,200 of his winnings to the church. Fischer felt fantastic. In his eyes, he was advancing the Worldwide Church of God and doing his part to appease the Lord. Upon winning the chess championship, the eccentric Fischer began fading into obscurity. He found solace in Pasadena, California, where the Worldwide Church of God headquarters was located. Fischer fraternized with the Worldwide Church members and began hanging around Herbert Armstrong and Ted. Upon meeting the leaders of the Worldwide Church of God, Fischer began feeling uneasy. Fischer observed followers of Herbert Armstrong would frequently follow him around in a robotic trance, repeating whatever their leader said. Whether they were brainwashed or just mesmerized by Herbert Armstrong's charisma wasn't clear, but something definitely felt off. Furthermore, Herbert Armstrong did not display the virtues he advertised. He seemed more concerned with acquiring assets and mingling with celebrities than serving the members of his church. On top of all that, Herbert's son Ted greatly annoyed Fischer. It was painfully obvious that Ted did not follow the values of the worldwide Church of God. Ted was known to have affairs with flight attendants on the family's private jets and lived a playboy lifestyle. If these transgressions weren't enough, the prophesied end of the world in 1975 came and went. Fischer felt cheated by the church, especially Herbert Armstrong. Upon further research, Fischer discovered that Herbert Armstrong had incorrectly predicted the end of the world in 1950 as well as 1952. The crafty former salesman had sold Fischer on the biggest lie imaginable. Even with this deception, Fischer was still willing to forgive the narcissistic Herbert Armstrong if only he'd apologize. If he could admit that he genuinely thought the world would end and was wrong, Fischer concedes he would have taken him back. However, that was not the case. For decades, Herbert Armstrong used doomsday scenarios to scare parishioners into donating more funds to his church. While some of the money was put towards the worldwide Church of God and its members, the majority was siphoned to Herbert Armstrong's bank account. It was foolish for Fischer to think Herbert Armstrong would change his ways now. He had perfected this racket over an entire lifetime. He was a manipulative charlatan. After the gig was up, Fischer attempted to distance himself from the worldwide Church of God. He denounced the church in interviews and spoke negatively about Herbert Armstrong. There is some speculation that Fischer and the Armstrongs eventually reconciled to some degree some years after 1975. However, that is debatable. It's often theorized that Fischer's deteriorating mental state later in life was due to Herbert Armstrong's brainwashing. Perhaps this was what turned the emotionally vulnerable Fischer into a hate-filled anti-Semite.
Well, this is all wonderful news. It's time for the fucking U.S. to get their heads kicked in. It's time to finish off the U.S. once and for all. Democracy is just a lot of bullshit. It's just been a cover for the criminal nature of the United States of America. I'm hoping, as I say, for a 7 days in May scenario where sane people will take over the U.S. now. You know what I mean? Sane people. Sane people. Military people, yes. They will imprison the Jews. They will execute several 100,000 of them at least. Fuck the U.S. I want to see the U.S. wiped out.
I plan to explore Fischer's mental state in more detail in a later video, so stay tuned. Herbert Armstrong died in 1986 at the age of 93. Instead of appointing Ted as his successor, Herbert Armstrong made it clear Joseph Tack was to take the reins. This was most likely due to Ted's lack of leadership skills and general ineptitude. Tack lacked the charisma of Herbert Armstrong, and the congregation greatly shrank as a result. Before his death, Herbert Armstrong feared liberal elements within the church would make doctrinal changes. These fears were validated as the worldwide church made significant revisions to its literature without Herbert Armstrong's guidance. This splintered the worldwide Church of God into various denominations, none of which resemble the original organization. The fact that Fischer was bamboozled by a doomsday preacher seems outrageous. Fischer had an IQ of 180 and was a world chess champion. He was able to see 20 moves ahead of the board, but couldn't see that he was being manipulated by a snake oil salesman like Herbert Armstrong. It begs the question, was Fischer an all-around genius like he claimed? Or was he merely a chess savant who used the board as an escape from his pain? Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this content, please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel.